Good. I think we're good to go. Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks very much for coming. Welcome to this session in Lau China Week. I'm Rhodri Williams, and I've got the pleasure of moderating this evening's session. I hope the microphone is working and you can hear me at the back. Looks like it. So our subject is China's approach to security and statecraft networks in the MENA region. And in the next 90 minutes, we're going to be talking about the nature and extent of Chinese influence in the region. We're going to be talking about the strategy or thinking behind it. We're going to be talking about the tools that are used and how those are changing. And finally, we'll be touching on, I think probably in some detail, the kind of ramifications of China's activity in the MENA region for the wider global geopolitical picture. We have an outstanding panel of experts, and I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then I'll tell you what the format of this is. So I have Zeno Leoni on my left, who is a lecturer in defense studies at King's College London and the author of Ground Strategy and the Rise of China. We have Andreas Krieg on my right, who is senior lecturer in the School of Security Studies at KCL. And Meia Nouwens, I hope I pronounced that right, apologies if I haven't, who's a senior fellow in Chinese security and defense policy at the IISS. And at the far end, we have Alessandro or Alex Arduino, who's an affiliate lecturer here at the Lau China Institute and the author of a book called Money and Mayhem, Mercenaries, Private Military Companies, Drones, and the Future of War. So I think we're in very good hands, and they're going to be sharing their expertise with us. The format is that I'm going to ask each of the speakers in turn to give us about 4 to 5 minutes of introductory comments. When they've all spoken, we'll have a bit of a panel discussion, a bit of a free-for-all up here. And then towards 7 o'clock, I'll close that section and I'll open things up for questions. So please don't go away early. Questions will come. And please don't go away early because there's drinks at the end. So it's worth staying the course. So I'm going to start with Zeno. I think you're going to kick us off. So a rather broad question for you, Zeno, but why is this topic important for the region, for China, and for the wider world?
Thank you very much. And sorry, good evening, everyone, and thanks for the invite. Thank you, Alex, for organizing this, and Shefali and to the Lau. This is the 4th China Week, and is the second one that that I'm attending as a speaker. So I'm very happy to be here. And I'm glad to see we are holding a panel on such a very important topic. This is not a banal point, and perhaps I want to explain why that is the case. And I want to do it a bit through the lenses of what I normally do, which is studying the relationship between the United States and China as much as I can, also in the region, but I'll go more in details later. But if you think about the Middle East and the Gulf and how this region, how important it is for the wider international order, and the central role that this has played in the US hegemony since the end of World War II. So the fact that China's engagement with the region is growing, and will continue to grow probably, it's absolutely a very critical event in history. I don't necessarily imply that the Gulf, the Middle East, will play the same role for China that they've played for the United States. Maybe the role of oil in 30 years will be different in the global economy compared to what it was until now or a few decades ago. This is not a banal point. I've started to work on this issue, China and the Middle East and the US, 4 years ago when I started when I was writing a chapter on this topic. And until more or less back then, there were not too many publications on this particular subject. I was just reading recently an article that came out only a few months ago, and the authors were opening the paper saying that the Middle East has emerged as one of the key arenas where current strategic rivalry is being played out. So that's not a banal statement, and this is also because of China. More specific about China and the Middle East, I think this is an important relationship because it's a bit like, so when I talk about the US and China, I think that has been a marriage of convenience for many years. But the one between China and the Middle East is it really sounds to me it looks to me as the perfect marriage. where China has a lot to provide to the region that the region needs, especially in terms of technology and infrastructure, and I think we will hear a bit of that later on. And then the region, especially the Gulf, has the resources to access this know-how that it really needs, because, again, the Gulf is changing quite a lot. All the Gulf countries have a new national security strategy, and they are adapting their economies to a changing world order. So in that sense, I think it seems to be a perfect marriage, and also for other regions. And so this engagement is growing of China in the region. I'll just mention briefly for now, I might go more in depth later, that this is driven by different documents involving the economic Silk Road, but more specifically the Arab policy paper. And if you read these documents, it's all about doing more in the Middle East, doing more in the Gulf for China. And just to give some numbers before concluding, this one in particular, we can give many numbers, and this one in particular comes from an interesting article appearing in the Diplomat. From 2017 to 2022, the China-Middle East trade almost doubled, growing from 260 million to about 500 million. So these are increasingly big numbers, and at the same time, China's strategic partnerships have grown with 12 Arab countries, and with many stakes in about 20 ports in the region. So I think this is a big issue, and it's something that I'm very glad we're talking about it today. On the other hand, and I'll stop here, increasingly we talk a lot about China. We hear discussions about books and papers about China taking over, becoming the next hegemon. And yet, I think if we look at what China can do and what cannot do in the region, we still have a lot of questions about China's projection of power. To what extent can China be influential in the region? And when it is not influential, when it cannot project its power, is it because it doesn't want? Is it because it cannot? Or it is because ultimately the Middle East is not so important for China as actually I think it is? I'll stop here and
thanks very much. We'll come back to that point about projection of power for sure in the discussion. I have a very quick follow-up for you. You started off talking about US hegemony, because one of the characteristics of the current situation is that many people think that the US hegemony is waning and that the US is withdrawing to some degree from the Middle East, despite its involvement with Israel. So I wonder to what extent the US withdrawal from the Middle East or weakening is a causal factor in looking at China's penetration or emergence.
Certainly is. Well, the fact that the US is less involved in the Middle East it causes concerns in Washington, because it's opening a lot of opportunities for China in the region. I get carried away quite a lot by this question, because I've done a PhD on Obama's pivot to Asia. And so I was all like, yes, the US is, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's leaving the Middle East, it's going to the Indo-Pacific. I think from a security perspective, traditional security perspective, we cannot say that. And I think the US continues to be unrivaled in the region from that point of view.
Right, thank you very much. Let's turn to Andreas now and talk a little bit about the nature of Chinese influence in the region. Andreas, you've done a lot of work and are currently working on network-centric statecraft. So first of all, can you tell us what it is? And tell us why it's important to understand it in making sense of what China is up to in MENA.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. Thanks for having me. I can follow on from what Zeno was talking about. And I think we need to redefine how we look at the region. I look at this relationship not from the Chinese point of view, but from the point of view of the Gulf, the point of view of the MENA region, and China being an external force coming in or not coming in. I look at the region as a networked order. It's not one that's state-centric. It's not one that's dictated by the 45 member states of the wider MENA region, but it's dictated by a variety of different networks that really control the flow of information, goods, capital, people, and so on. And we're looking particularly at commercial entities. They're becoming increasingly important for the Gulf states as well to advance their interests. So they're not using their Ministry of Defenses or their Ministry of Foreign Affairs or their state bureaucracies, but they're using private networks. And the Chinese have understood how to work with private networks as well. So my book, I mean, it sounds extremely academic. Network-centric statecraft is basically about weaponizing interdependence, creating interdependence between different nodes. And that's not just state on state, but C to C, commercial to commercial, individual to individual. And what the Chinese have tried to do, and it looks seemingly very benign, is when they come in, they create interdependency, where a reciprocal arrangement between different companies when it comes to the flow of tech, when it comes to energy, when it comes to financial services, when it comes to logistics. Seemingly very benign. But over time, the Chinese have shown that these fairly benign reciprocal relationships move from interdependence to codependence. And here, this is where network-centric statecraft really provides you with power, with leverage, which can be extremely coercive as well, despite the fact that it looks fairly consensual. It looks like, oh, it's a very benign commercial to commercial relationship. But obviously, they are trying to extract, concessions from this relationship. And what you end up with is a very non-linear approach to statecraft, which means it's not top down. It's not, obviously, it's very much controlled from the top, but I would rather than call it top down, I would call it core periphery. There's a Chinese core of decision making, while the further you go away from China, you have networks that operate in the periphery with some degree of autonomy. And why is China doing it? Because China has, conventionally speaking, no way to compete with the United States in the MENA region. In the military domain, it has no ability, no willingness to actually deploy boots on the ground or do anything comparative to what the United States is doing. I've worked in and lived in the Middle East for nearly 20 years and worked with militaries across the Gulf. And, what the Americans, what even we in the UK are providing to the Middle East is something the Chinese don't even want to provide. They can't provide. When it comes to, diplomacy as well, they're trying to kind of create these interlinkages, trying to mediate this Saudi-Iran sort of rapprochement, but that's something that they exploited. I mean, all the groundwork, the foundation was laid by us, as in the West, by the United States and so on. So the Chinese are exploiting that, and it's very rarely underwritten by hard power. There is another element to it that when I speak to people in the Middle East, that is lacking from Chinese engagement in the Middle East is the lack of appeal that China has. China is not an appealing partner to most Middle Easterners and most Gulfies. Why I'm saying that is, if you ask your average Gulfie about where they want to study, nobody's saying, I want to go to Beijing or I want to live in China. They say, I want to go to London, or I want to go to New York. Despite all the friction that we have on the very strategic level about what the West is projecting to the region, vis-a-vis what China is projecting or not projecting, the appeal isn't there. So in the information domain as well, China doesn't really move the hearts and minds of the region. So what is left, and that's, I think, is the most important part of that relationship, is economics. And this is where, commercial statecraft or network-centric statecraft begins, is China has something to offer in the commercial domain. And that is energy. It's a major customer for energy. So it's the root cause or the source for wealth for most of the Gulf countries. Because they sell most of their hydrocarbons to China. So it's something that's not very diversified. When it comes to high tech and AI as well, these sort of relationships, very important, C to C. Again, China can provide something that the West is unwilling to provide. And then when it comes to logistics as well, we see a lot of integration between local logistics companies, kind of opening up new trade corridors into Central Asia. And again, China's playing a role there. And defense equipment. But even there in defense equipment, if you look at the amount of military hardware being sold to the Middle East and compare that what we in the West are selling vis-a-vis what the Chinese are selling, it's a small fraction. I don't see that this is going to change anytime soon. So it's a very new, innovative way of statecraft. It looks benign. It's very much orchestrated from the core, but obviously the further it goes away from the core, it becomes more or less, there's a degree of autonomy. But what looks commercial, if you scratch the surface a little bit, you realize that most of it is state-owned or state-facilitated, state-owned companies, state-owned banks underwriting these investments. So in the end of the day, what looks like a C2C benign relationship is a relationship that's very much driven by the core of power in Beijing.
That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, you said towards the end, this is a new form of statecraft, but I'm a historian originally, and I would say that there are a lot of echoes in what you were saying about the way that power is projected through commercial relationships, which relates to the British Empire.
Absolutely.
And the way that Britain used trading companies through the 19th century. Quick follow-up for you. Nobody escapes the quick follow-up. This idea of control from the top, and then as it were, the scope for autonomy increasing as you go out. What dictates the autonomy that these actors in the periphery have? What dictates their ability to be somewhat autonomous from Beijing's control?
Well, effective control is a very difficult concept that needs to be defined. And, why I say autonomy, we think about China as a dictatorship, right? As a hierarchy, which is extremely controlled from the top to the bottom. But you realize that, somewhere along the line, as commercial actors have degrees of autonomy and they get involved, they have agency to decide where they invest and where they don't invest. They are incentivized to invest. I mean, we see clusters of investments, particularly in the UAE, but also in other parts of the Middle East, where you have a state-owned company, for example, mostly hydrocarbons, investing somewhere. And that kind of creates a bridgehead, which allows other Chinese companies to follow and kind of invest there as well. They're not being forced by the states most of the time to do that, right? We always think about everything is controlled. But obviously, if the incentive is given by the Ministry of Commerce or, a state-owned oil company or a state-owned logistics company, then there is a degree of collaboration and integration between what the commercial actors are doing and what the state is doing.
Thank you. That was great. Let's pivot around to Meia now. Now it's your turn. So we've been talking getting closer to the nature of Chinese engagement. And Meia, I know you've doing a lot of work around this. So the specific areas where the Chinese penetration is most obvious. I think what would really interest us would be your thoughts on the whole technological sphere and sort of an AI and the new technologies and the extent to which collaboration between China and the Gulf states is starting to happen.
Sure. Thanks for that. I completely agree with what my two co-panelists have already talked about, but I think there's an extra dimension here when we talk about technology. There is, of course, an element of Chinese strategy that is about exporting technology, and we focus on that a lot. Exporting of surveillance systems technology, exporting of communications technology like 5G communications networks. But there's another element to technological cooperation that's becoming much more collaborative. And the Gulf is very important in this. In the sense that in the past, if you looked at where Chinese research institutes, universities, private sector companies used to look to collaborate with other counterparts, it would have been the West. Now, obviously, as we've all seen over the last few years, that's become more and more difficult. What you see post-COVID is a much starker turn towards collaboration in emerging and disruptive technologies with emerging economies. Why is that the case? One, there's funding, usually, particularly if you look at the Gulf. Second of all, there are tech-savvy societies here that have innovation at home that is of interest to the PRC, whether those are universities or companies or research institutes. And so there is a natural ecosystem that's seemingly developing here on the research side, whereby I think we're kind of missing a trick in the West, thinking that our export controls have kind of solved the technological competition between the US and China or China and the West. But actual fact, these networks with China are becoming much more international. That does, of course, play out into how competition is expressed in these countries themselves. You particularly can see that in countries like the UAE, who are very interested in, of course, leveraging emerging and disruptive technologies to diversify their economies moving forward, away from just being solely or majoritively dependent on energy exports. But second of all, there is a really important relationship here, as expressed already by Andreas, with the United States. The United States is still seen as the predominant power, as the preferred power for and partner for countries in the Middle East, not China. And so if you then look at kind of where tech collaboration sits in all of this, it actually doesn't really fit very well in this picture. So countries in the Gulf in particular are starting to try to diversify how they collaborate with the United States on technology, and there is a defense angle on that as well, and how they balance that with their continued interest to hedge and to explore relationships and possibilities with the PRC in technology. You see that happening within the ecosystem in the Gulf in particular, with potentially companies and government funds collaborating with the United States, universities and research bodies collaborating more potentially with Chinese companies and counterparts on emerging and disruptive technologies. There is, of course, a defense angle, and I did want to touch on that really briefly. It's absolutely correct that Chinese defense relationships with the Gulf are much smaller than that of the United States, but it is an area of interest and it is a growing area of focus for the PRC. Just to put this in comparison, the United States between 2010 and 2020 exported around $19 billion worth of defense exports to the Middle East region. China only 245 million. So it's a much smaller scale that we're talking about. That doesn't matter. That doesn't mean that it doesn't matter and that it's unimportant. These exports are of interest to China. Exporting UAV technology, exporting missile technology provides Chinese defense industry and the PLA with an opportunity to understand how these technologies can be used in practice in actual warfare, which of course the Chinese don't have an opportunity to do. There are other areas in which this is expressed, offset to a very, very limited extent, which is what the Middle East actually wants. There is collaboration, even more limited, but of course, exercises are an area where you see the two militaries cooperate a little bit more and more. And this isn't just bilaterally, it's also trilaterally. Think of, for example, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and China exercising in the region, and also in China as well. Most recently, the UAE and Air Force and the People's Liberation Army Air Force, the PLAF, conducted the Falcon Shield exercise in China, which gave the Chinese an opportunity to understand and work right alongside a Western aircraft to the Mirage 2000 that the UAE Air Force operated in China. So there's plenty here for China to benefit as well as countries in the Gulf. Thanks.
Thanks very much. On the defense point and the Chinese increasingly collaborating with Gulf forces, I'm very struck, in a sort of NATO context, the ability of NATO countries, UK, US, and so on, to invite officers at a certain point in their career to the UK or the US to go to Sandhurst, to go through training, to be alongside Western NATO officers has been very important. To what extent is that happening in the Chinese context? Are they training in China officers from the Gulf armies?
Yeah, so professional military education courses are an increasingly interesting tool of statecraft and relationship building, particularly with defense and military elites of other countries. So those courses are taking place in China. In the past, the response and kind of the feedback from participants of those courses hasn't been overwhelmingly positive. The courses will have been given in a language that participants didn't really understand. They complained that they were kind of relayed to a far off place in the sticks somewhere that they couldn't engage with their counterparts in the PLA. So there's room for improvement, but that improvement is taking place from what we know. The ultimate question, though, is do people who participate in those courses actually go back home? What do they take away? And does it help their careers progress within their militaries? And that's a question that I'll be researching next year.
Very interesting. We'll come back and talk about it. Thank you very much, Meia. So, Alex, our last speaker, the title is MENA. We haven't mentioned Africa yet. You are an expert on Chinese involvement in Africa, particularly on the military side. So how do we relate what the Chinese are doing in Africa to what we've been hearing about China's influence in the MEN?
Thank you, Rhodri, for keeping the easy question for the last one. Having said that, I do believe, in my personal opinion, that China has the same core problem in the Middle East as well in Africa, meaning how to translate economic power into political influence. Everyone from the Middle East to Africa recognizes China as an economic juggernaut. Nobody is recognizing China as a sole military guarantor, as it can be the United States, for example. So as Zeno correctly pointed out, there is a perception in the Middle East that the US is leaving. Same perception is in Africa. That doesn't mean that US military is not there. AFRICOM is there, CENTCOM is there, but perception is very important. If we look at France in Africa with the ending of Operation Barkhane, okay, that's another story. They've been unceremoniously kicked out of Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic. But then if we see how the crisis in the Middle East is evolving, it's a different story than how it's happening in Africa. Meaning that in the Middle East, China is slowly retreating to the principle of non-interference, to shuttle diplomacy, sending top envoy in a different country. But again, it's more a moral support to Lebanon and Iran than real action. In Africa, the idea that China has with the Global Security Initiative is totally different. That doesn't mean that while the Middle East is on fire, again, Africa is doing well. Africa is subject of a widespread insecurity and crisis that is due to the fact that climate change is worsening socioeconomic conditions. There is a rise in criminal activity, as well as a rise of international and local terrorist activity. Al-Qaeda, Daesh are thriving in areas that run from Somalia to Sudan to Sahel. The Sahel itself is called the coup belt, not by chance. Most of the government in the last 4 years have all changed the head of the government due to a military coup. But in this area that look even more complex than the Middle East, China has some perception that can do something that is beyond the Belt and Road infrastructure and economic power. Instead of giving you number or theoretical approach, I just tell you a story. I was in Shanghai last month doing a keynote speak on how to protect Chinese investment on the Belt and Road. And not many people asked me about the Middle East. All the questions were DRC, Somalia, Africa, because China has the impression that can really translate this economic power into political and security influence. And how is planning to do that? In my personal opinion, is centered on 3 key pillars. The first one is promoting the role of private security company. There is a lot of talk about private security, private military, but it's all centered long ago on the Blackwater in Iraq, for example, or the Wagner Group now in Africa. China is a thriving, developing private security sector that is looking to fill the security gap and vacuum that the PLA, thanks to the fact there is principle of non-interference, is not willing or not capable in performing it. Then the second point, and quite important, is military weapon sales. Of course, the US is the leading in selling weapons in Africa, 40%, but normally Russia is followed by France. But for the first time, if we look at the Sahel region, China is at the top in selling weapons, 19%, followed by Russia, and then followed by France. Of course, Russia is under sanction. There is an increasing anti-French sentiment in all the region, but that itself alone doesn't justify this rise of China. Again, I'm not looking at number. There is a very specific image in my mind, and it was just a few weeks ago when the Wagner Group was attacked in an ambush by the Tuareg in northern Mali. More than 80 fighters from Wagner were killed. And all the gruesome video that you can see on YouTube pinpoint the trophy that the Tuareg rebel get in their possession and the corpse of the Wagner fighter killed there. But one image stuck my mind. That image was in the background. It was a blow-up armored vehicle used by Wagner Group, and it was a VPN-11 MRAP produced by Norinco, meaning that the tip of the spear of Russia in Africa was riding Chinese armored vehicle, and in my opinion was quite important. And the third part that Meia also touched upon it is military diplomacy. That is working for China pretty well in Africa. By military diplomacy, I mean training between the army, and there was a recent war game called Peace and Unity, carried with Tanzania and Mozambique. And in my opinion, was interesting looking at this specific war game, not only what doctrine or what the PLA employed, but one important fact that struck me. Several generals from Tanzania were speaking Chinese, meaning that from quite early on, they were trained in China. And I was just leaving.
That's very interesting, relating to the point you were making, Mayor, about in some in Africa, maybe the relationships are going deeper and maybe longer duration. Has Chinese private security as the defensive arm of their activity has been tested? Have there been any incidents where a Chinese private security company has actually been deployed to get Chinese nationals or Chinese business out of a dangerous situation? I mean, you've described Africa, turbulence, political instability, terrorism and so on. Have we had any
That's
incidents?
a question that Beijing is asking to the private security sector in China on a daily basis. What Beijing is extremely afraid of is a kind of Blackwater moment in Tahrir Square happening. What I mean by that, Blackwater, when was contracted by the DoD and by state, US, during the Iraq war, unleashed fire on civilian in Tahrir Square, killing 17 civilian, and it took years to just put on trial the contractor from Blackwater. So if you have an armed Chinese private security killing civilian from Africa to the Middle East, how Beijing is going to justify the win-win narrative of the Belt and Road. And that's the reason why Chinese private security, while they are developing, they are getting more professional, are unarmed, except the one that work in anti-piracy on the vessel near Somalia. They are unarmed, meaning that they contract local armed forces or local or international armed contractors. Not long ago, a decade ago, most of the armed contractors were British, American, coming with cooperation with top player in a private military and private security environment. But since Obama administration, and especially during the Trump administration, there has been a progressive detachment. But the bigger problem that I'm looking right now is if the Chinese are not following, let's call it a Blackwater model, are they going to follow a Wagner model?
Well, what's extremely interesting about that, I mean, you need to read Alex's book, I think, as many people as possible, but what's really interesting is that actually Chinese may be using foreign contractors to do their security in Africa, and it's sort of Chinese managers of security who are working in these companies.
Yes.
Right, we're gonna have a little pause and see, you've heard each other speaking, and I just want to give you a chance to kind of add anything to what you've heard, to comment on what your colleagues have said, or to, chip in. So Zeno, we'll come back to you.
Yeah, I think I was just, so I noted down quite a lot of things, and well, I was, from my perspective, and from a big picture perspective, as I, like what I said before, I actually remembered about a course that we were running, a short course we were running at the Defense Academy, and I think Andreas, we designed it together and with other colleagues. It was called the Gulf between West and East. And I think from a big picture perspective, the sort of details that have been shared now, rightly remind me of that. I think there's two dimensions. One is that the international order is changing, and the other is that the region is changing. Especially the Gulf, and going back to the role of oil and the fact that this is so central, has been central to the relationship between the Gulf and the US, but that might not be central in the future. So I think there is a need from regional powers to think about what's next, because the relationship with the US is about selling oil in dollars, right? And in exchange for security. Fundamentally, has always been about that, but that might end. So on the one hand, there are the local powers looking to establish new profitable partnerships with other countries. And so speaking about the Gulf between West and East, also with Russia, China, and so on, India. And then there is, broadly speaking, on international order level, the sort of new Cold War, and many colleagues don't agree with that, but certainly there is this strategic competition between the US and China. I think is a competition that is very different from what we see in the Western Pacific, in the Middle East, because as we heard, the political and military element when it comes to China is only there to an extent. And that's why I wanted to cite just a couple of articles from the literature. There's some colleagues, including myself. So in my paper, I was talking about modus vivendi, just to be clever, using Latin, but others talked about competitive coexistence. And so competing on different levels, the US and China in the region, but not on that dimension, which could then, become concerning, like in the South China Sea. Others think there's a strategy of China to outbid the US, and so China trying to build its sphere of influence I think we're very far from that. Just a final point. But I think China, what is China really up to in the region is about trying to be the political capital, so making friends, getting these countries to vote in its favors in multilateral institutions, getting oil, getting resources, and eventually hosting, letting its troops, its naval assets dock there and access those places if needed in the future.
Investing for the future. Andreas, any other reflections or?
Well, I wanted to dive into the points about the role of companies, because the UAE are playing the very same game that the Chinese are playing, also network-centric statecraft, also using commercial entities for the most part. And as we heard, obviously, Saudi and the UAE are trying to build an AI economy. That's their major growth area. That's where they put most of their investments at the moment. And so outside the energy domain, that's the key growth area where I think, and this is more than just commerce and growth. This is about digital authoritarianism, surveillance, and information security, cybersecurity, and all of the above. Where the Emiratis are saying this is going to be the future, this is where we're going to compete. This is no longer fifth generation military. This is the next generation of security competition, and we can only excel if we get support from outside. And they're doing that in a way, and that I think is a fairly increasingly zero-sum competition with the United States in particular, but also here in the UK, we're raising some concerns. Someone mentioned the Mirage 2000, the Falcon exercise. Yes. That is the fact that they sent the old Mirage was because obviously had they sent F-16s or had they sent other more advanced technology, that it would have raised major concerns. Because the major concern here is, if you look at the data networks within the UAE, and the UAE are a leading surveillance country in the world, and say they're probably where the Chinese are. They're far more advanced than North Korea or Iran or Saudi or any other country in the region. Why I'm saying that is because it's no longer just the guy following you around. It's very invasive in terms of how they get access to your phones, your data security, your handheld devices, whatever it is. And so it's a network of data centers. It's a network of R&D facilities in the AI sector, where there are joint ventures with Chinese companies in the loop, if you will. So if you take a network-centric approach, there is always a Chinese entity in the loop, and it mostly been run through joint ventures between a company which now had to sever relations with Chinese, which is G42, and they've done it due to US pressure to do so. But despite the fact what happened over the last decade is so many joint ventures which are where they have an affiliate entity which is very closely related to the National Security Advisor's office in Abu Dhabi, doing joint ventures with Chinese companies to get access to technology and also sharing data. So what you end up with is kind of a network where you have a Chinese state-owned entity in the loop. And the issue that we have here in the West is when we're selling advanced technology to the UAE, as we do, is that the data networks and the data centers themselves are no longer secure from Chinese intervention. So if you have an F-35 and the UAE have been bidding for the F-35 and haven't gotten it and probably won't get it, is because it's an extremely sensor-heavy platform, which means it kind of pushes out a lot of data. And if these data centers and data networks are penetrated by Chinese entities who are on the loop, you're essentially giving away very, very, very essential, very important sort of data to the Chinese. And so for the Emiratis in particular, but also for the Saudis, it becomes an increasingly more difficult game to play because the competition that Zeno is talking about is becoming more zero-sum. Yeah. Even if the Gulfies think, oh no, it's a win-win, we can take from both sides.
I mean, a really important point is that we've been talking about the Gulf. Actually, what you are talking about mainly is the UAE and to some extent Saudi. Yeah. So one does need to differentiate. We haven't mentioned Kuwait, we haven't mentioned Bahrain. And it's not just the main two, but in terms of geostrategy, geopolitics, it's those two that we're.
Well, it's primarily, so the UAE is the gateway for China to the Middle East.
Yeah. Okay. Meia, any
Sure.
thoughts or reflections?
Yeah, I think on that point of defense and AI and tech kind of overlapping, I think that's quite right. And it is going to force countries to try and have to make certain choices about where they align. As Andreas already said, that's happening. As I mentioned, that is predominantly happening in the Gulf, but there's a lot of other countries where those choices aren't necessarily being made in the same way. I think here opportunism is a key word to remember. And for the Chinese perspective, again, it's very important to think about what countries in the Gulf, like the UAE and Saudi, are willing to trade between the US and China in order to kind of play both sides. For a lot of other countries, that's not yet the case. And we have seen other examples in, for example, Northeast Asia, where countries have tried to play it both ways. South Korea, for example, hosts US forces, and they still had Huawei components in their 5G network. What they did was they made a buffer bubble around any US Forces Korea site within a certain range and within a certain depth of the network that was completely exclusive of Chinese components. So it'd be interesting to see to what extent countries in the Gulf try to find ways around having to make a choice. Now, obviously, if you're an F-35 potential importer, you're going to have to really make those choices, and there's no way around that. But there's others who don't. Here, there's also the element of really looking to China for defense industrial cooperation where the United States won't or can't collaborate. Countries have engaged with China to a certain extent. There is a Chinese UAV factory for the CH-4 variant UAV in Saudi Arabia. I'm not really quite sure to what extent that's actually profitable or actually producing. But there's other countries in the region who have imported Chinese technology and haven't been quite happy with it either. So we focused a lot on the Gulf. We can look at Jordan, for example, which found that Chinese missile technology and Chinese UAV technology was far from what they had expected, and actually sold off some of their UAVs to Western African countries instead. After they were disappointed. But from the Chinese perspective, there's also an issue here of risk appetite. And I think the more that there's a narrative that's being pushed that the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East and the Gulf, no longer a loyal or dependable partner, the more that China, of course, builds and capitalizes on that narrative as an up-and-coming partner of choice for these countries, the more that they might also be building expectations of how far they're willing to go in that relationship. And so here, I think the Chinese themselves, Beijing has to carefully play that card to not make it seem as if China will suddenly replace the United States in its entirety as a defense and security partner, because that is the last thing that Beijing would want for its relationship with the Middle East.
They kind of want power without responsibility, it seems to me.
Yeah, yeah.
Alex, your turn to chip in, and then I think I'm going to open it up.
I was planning to just say the same thing that Meia said. I'm trying to get smart.
No, you can't say something different. You've got to say something different.
Basically, as everyone mentioned, the new name of the game in the Middle East and with far less extent in Africa is balancing act. As Meia said, you have to take a decision. Which one? Countries don't want to take this decision because still China is, as I mentioned, an economic juggernaut. But then when it's security providing, it's a different game. And in this respect, I think that what Meia just mentioned about the drone is quite interesting. Because everyone thinks that combat drone, UAV, the US is the leading exporter. It's not. The race for the top place is between Turkey and China, not with the US. US, yes, produced the top military drone in the world, but like Rolls-Royce, it's not for everyone. It is a huge shock price. And at the same time, the US is not willing to sell top technology to many countries. In this respect, China is more open. The law in restricting UAV export is just something quite recent, a few months ago, but basically it's selling to everyone, like Turkey in some respect. And I still remember President Erdogan, when was visiting Ethiopia, if I recall correct, he just mentioned that everywhere I go, they just ask me one thing, Bayraktar BT-2 drones. So there is this ongoing competition between Turkey and China for combat military drone that will expand beyond the Middle East and into Africa. And as I mentioned before, with this balancing act, also we don't have to forget that African countries have agency. They are just not a pawn in between two great powers. We've been discussing about the friction between China and the US, but also the Gulf, Turkey, especially UAE, Saudi Arabia, are rising player in Africa. And these create more complex picture and more instability.
Well, that goes back to Zeno's original point about the changing nature of the international order. And the fact that you have this US-China competition is creating space for middle powers and rising powers to do more. Okay, our panel have given you a lot of food for thought. So it's your turn now to come back with some questions. So fire away. Don't be shy, please.
Thank you all very much.
Sorry, could you stand? That'd be really helpful. I know it's embarrassing, but if you
Thank you all for an excellent panel presentation. I just wanted to ask about how the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the new kind of axis that's developing in and around different connections between Iran, North Korea, and China in that conflict is changing China's objectives in the region.
Great, thank you very much. Nice brisk question, brisk answers, and we'll get 4 of them in. So Alex, I'll come to you first.
Okay, on this I can quote an article that came up a while ago from the Royal United Service Institute that was mentioning it was not a surprise that it was an exchange of weapons between Russia and Iran. What is surprising is the direction. Nobody was thinking that it's Iran to selling stuff to Russia. So as you see now, this in relation with China, it's quite interesting because in the Middle East until October 7, China was one of the few great power, or basically the only one who managed to keep good relation with everyone. Good relation with Palestine, good relation with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with Iran. In 2023, it also brokered an unprecedented entente between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But then everyone at this balancing act, with the exception of Tehran. Tehran had only one choice, getting Chinese stuff or getting Chinese stuff. Now this is changing. So it's changing the overall perspective in the geopolitical relation in the region, just because now it opened up this relationship between Moscow and Tehran. And we saw this just a few weeks ago, because despite sanctions, there is still some inkling that China is absorbing Iranian oil. And the first time Tehran mentioned that is no more willing to sell it to China at a discounted price.
So in terms of the Ukraine that was mentioned, I mean, you're seeing the relationship Iran-Moscow sort of drawing the Chinese in some sense. Is that, am I misunderstanding? Or?
No, on that respect, I mean, since the sanctions started to hit, China has been very accurate in saying that was not any kind of relationship. Then there has been a lot of discussion if in weapon sale, of course, component are going to get there. But every time Ukrainian forensic team on the battlefield are going to examine an UAV, they are going to find hardware pieces coming from all over the world.
Andreas, would you comment on the question?
No, I don't have anything to.
Okay.
Yes, I'm just thinking if there's anything. I wrote an article recently about geopolitical blocks, and which it says that the international order is dividing in this block, and I think I'm not the only one who's written about it, and I wrote about it with a colleague, by the way. But anyway, so the war in Ukraine seems to be quite a catalyst of this return to geopolitical blocks, and well, the reaction of China about the war in Ukraine it has surprised the West, and yeah, I think it's about I think Chinese elites are convinced that right now in this historical moment they cannot be friends with Europe, with the US in the same way that they were 20 years ago. So it's not surprising that reaction, and I think. By the same logic, to answer the question, it reinforces China's engagement with the region to the extent that they realize that that's where they can make political gains, not in Europe, not in the West. So it only probably reinforces Chinese engagement there.
Yeah, okay. Meia?
Yeah, I want to add something, which is that we kind of seem to group Iran, debarricade China, and Russia together as one kind of foursome. But of course, they have different interests and they have different methods of achieving their goals. And I think what's really interesting after the war in Ukraine and Russia's kind of growing dependence on external actors for supplies into their defense industrial base, namely Iran, but of course also most recently the DPRK, is what the repercussions of that are for China, not in a positive way. Because in the past, previously, you would have looked at China as a stronger partner in the China-Iran relationship, stronger partner in the China-DPRK relationship. But these countries, when given an alternative option, might make decisions that are contrary to Chinese interests. Certainly, that's the case in what we're seeing with Russia in kind of the triangular relationship between Russia, the DPRK, and China. To what extent does a closer relationship between Russia and the DPRK actually benefit China? Leader of the DPRK is an incredibly, let's say, strong-minded leader who might take decisions that go against Chinese interests. That was the case, as we saw during the Trump administration, when the US and the DPRK became closer and had a diplomatic engagement at some level. I think you'll see the same thing now. Following the meeting between the leaders of Russia and the DPRK, the Chinese responded by sending a much lower level delegation to Pyongyang for the first time in a long time to signal that displeasure. So I think it's how these triangular relationship also complicate China's ability to exert control and influence. That is something that we need to keep an eye on in the future.
Thanks. That's a great point. Alex, you wanted to come in on
Yes,
that?
just to jump in with a quick remark on excellent question. Of course, Ukraine is on our door. The war is near. We feel it more near, but we don't have to forget. And then back in the discussion to Africa, the fact that there are forgotten wars. It's Libya. It's Sudan, it's a huge humanitarian crisis. Syria, still in some part, is not resolved, and as well as Yemen. And if we forget this war, these are coming back to bite us. Nobody know Ansar Allah until a few months ago, the Houthis. Now it's on everybody's newspaper, but the war in Yemen didn't start yesterday.
Yeah, sure.
Good, very important point. Goes back to my networked order thing. Non-state actors have taken over order in terms of they have a much more structural place in shaping the order of the region and also in Africa, where states have, are failing, or where states actually enter into assemblages with non-state actors to kind of build these sort of partnerships. So we completely underestimate where this region is going when we only look at state on state. But what I want to say about Palestine, Sudan, Libya, and all these other forgotten wars in Africa is that the Chinese don't do anything there, nothing productive. What they do is they serve their own interest. But the fact is, what the West is doing is so counterproductive. I think what we're doing or not doing in Palestine right now is probably, it's going to be remembered as probably the greatest crisis in the post-Iraq war in the last 20, maybe even longer years, where the West has not stood by its values. And it's so much, China has no answer to this. China has no answer to Palestine, has no answer to Libya, has no answer to Sudan, but it doesn't have to. Because all it does, it's kind of exploiting in this sort of massive war of narratives that we're in globally. All it has to do is kind of point the finger at the discrepancies between, or the say-do gap between what we're advocating in terms of values and what we're not doing about our values. And I think Palestine is going to be, it broke the backbone of US leadership in the region. It has broken, it continues to break the legitimacy of any Western country, which we kind of still trying to tread very carefully, not to call out war crimes that Israel is obviously committing. We're still very concerned about, saying how it is, while we're very, very comfortable probably calling out the Russians and calling out the Chinese when they're doing something wrong. So the Chinese are just reversing this and using that against us at a time when we are, we're so, kind of fluffed in our little sort of echo chamber where we keep on telling ourselves the kind of moral advancements. We're calling out the Russians, and rightly so, and we're calling out the Chinese for what they're doing. But then we're picking and choosing when it comes to these conflicts, and I think that's a massive advantage for the Chinese.
That's a hugely important point. There's quite an interesting article in the Times today by William Hague, the former Tory leader, about cognitive warfare, and he's making the point that the starting point is that the BBC is no longer able to fund the BBC World Service, and the BBC World Service is withdrawing its services from Southeast Asia and from the Middle East. And the Chinese and the Russians are filling the void. They're coming in and offering their broadcast services to countries in the region. And his broader point is that we don't think like this. We're not thinking about information and the narrative. I love the phrase, the war of narratives, which is sort of raging. And we don't think about this, but the Chinese do. So I think it's a really interesting thing here about the durability of that sort of influence? You know, if you're making the point that Ukraine will last, but to what extent does this kind of soft power, the development of hostile narratives and the percolation of hostile narratives through broadcasting and social media, how durable is that? Is it really the basis of the power projection we were talking about? I throw that out there, but I don't expect an answer. Let's go back to the audience. Questions? Hand over here. Yeah. Can you just stand up? Do you mind standing up so we can see you? Thanks.
Thank you very much for this very interesting panel. I want to look a bit more at the Saudi UAE competition that's ongoing, and also maybe with the angle of China. So saying that UAE is basically the corridor of China to the region, how does Saudi balance this? And maybe also considering, like, in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, this new initiative in Europe, trying to build a corridor through Saudi to India.
Great question.
Yeah, no, very important question. So competition in the Gulf, we always think about as one block, right? 6 countries, but not least since 2017 when we had the last Gulf crisis, but even ever since, we see that different competing elements between different countries. So it was one stage was Saudi, Qatar, UAE. Now it is more UAE and Saudi, as you say. And this is mostly about growth. This is not about ideology. This is not like the conflict with Qatar about, foreign and security policy. This is a conflict about growth, investments. And the competition for FDI is so important in the Gulf right now. And where you can see that the Emiratis have a competitive edge. The Emiratis developed at a much earlier stage. And again, going back, looking at using the analogy of networks, the way networks work is it's a rich get richer phenomenon. So if you develop into a hub in a network, you incrementally, over time will increase attract more and more of the flow, more of the investments and so on. The UAE have been already a hub for a long time. Dubai has been a long hub for, looking at the region and what flows are important. Logistics, absolutely #1 hub. DP World is one of the most important, logistics companies in the world, based in Dubai. They control all the major ports around the Gulf, Indian Ocean, Red Sea. If we look at, financial services, again, the UAE attracting most of the capital, most of the investments go through companies in the UAE. So again, massive leadership role. It's extremely diversified in terms of the human capital that the UAE can attract, and as they still can attract a lot of that. So they are around 20 years ahead of where the Saudis are. So the Saudis, obviously, through the PIF, the Public Investment Fund, putting billions and billions in trying to compete with this. Now, telling companies that if you want to do business in Saudi, you need to have your regional headquarter in Saudi Arabia. This shows how desperate the Saudis are to actually attract that sort of capital. And that goes also to the Chinese. The Chinese go, and that's the thing, if you're a hub in a network, you are going towards where it's most convenient to you. And, if you want to do business in the MENA region, if you do import, export, anything to do with logistics, if you want to trade energy, financial services, where do you go as a Chinese company? Go to the UAE. And then obviously on top of that, the AI and tech hub that they are. Again, both of them are saying, both Saudi and UAE are saying we want to be an AI-based economy. But the UAE are much closer to achieving that than the Saudis are. And the Saudi is still a very sluggish, massive bureaucracy, moving very slowly. It's a country of 32 million people, while the Emiratis is a country of 1 million citizens, a lot more agile, a lot more, again, network-centric. Tahnun bin Zayed, the National Security Advisor, he did a study 15, 16 years ago about how networks can be exploited for national power. This has kind of inspired me writing the book in the first place. And so they have understood how to do that. But, when it comes to Chinese investments, the Chinese have, invested in Saudi when it comes to missile technology, drone technology, and how much have they produced? Probably not much. I think they're just seeking an opportunity. But I think the relationship with the only way that the Saudis are more important is oil. That's where I think the Saudi leverage over OPEC in particular, that's in terms of oil markets, that's why Saudi is more important than the UAE. In all other domains from a Chinese point of view, it's the UAE. They have a hub status that the Saudis can't take away from them.
That's very clear. Zeno, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I cannot possibly add anything else, but just to touch on a broader point, you mentioned risk appetite before, and I think the issue of China not doing partnership or alliances rather than partnership came up, and I think all this suggests how complex this region is, and not just this region, how complex is going out there and trying to become hegemonic. Even that this is always the question about China: is the next hegemon? is displacing the US. Well, that comes also with having to take a side in the middle of a lot of controversial issues. We still don't know whether that, facilitating those talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia were really, was something really meaningful. Probably not, or maybe we'll find out. The US at a systemic level has been quite successful. They've been friends of Israel and Arab countries at the same time. But that's the big picture. If you take a more granular picture, there's a lot of contradiction, and this has been biting the US quite a lot. So I don't know, when I give a lecture to my students, to the military, I invite them to reflect that China is rising, but is it dominating? Does it want to dominate? And when you think about all the complexity that you've just unpacked, I mean, I think there's some colleagues who rush to quick conclusions. That's what I'm trying to say, and that China will displace the US hegemony beyond the Western Pacific and so on. I think that these are quite telling examples.
Mhm.
But we should take a non-binary, non-dyadic view on this. It's not a zero. So it's not like black or white. It's everything is somewhat in the gray zone, isn't it?
Wow,
We love that
what a
word.
marvelous point for an academic institution. Everything is grey. We can talk about it for years to come and write endless papers. Next question. Yeah, over here.
Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering if you could develop a bit more on the difference between Russian and Chinese private military and security companies, because it seems to me that Russia with Wagner has had quite a proactive approach, whereas China is maybe playing more in the long game. So yeah, if you could just develop on that a bit, please.
Absolutely, great point and great question. There is a huge ongoing debate in the definition between mercenary, private military, and private security. If we want to keep it simple, mercenary, and we look at the Geneva Convention and that Article 49, is someone that fought in a foreign war and is paid for that. And the army of his country is not involved into that, mercenary. We know since dawn of time, there's not a reason it's called the second oldest profession. Private military saw a surge in the conflict in Iraq and is working up to now, but still is a gray area of definition, because when it's active, when it's passive, augmenting a military capability, just providing training or weapon platform, is still being involved in a war. So this is one of the questions. Private security is more easy. It's passive and it's mostly armed guard that guard infrastructure or VIP or other people against criminal violence. That's very simple, very straightforward. In legal term, it's not. With the law, it's very difficult to charge someone on the crime of mercenaries. And it's only in the African continent, it's a crime, while the other aspect is not a crime. So if we want to keep it simple, Wagner is the tip of the spear of Russia geopolitical and security expansion in Africa. But then if we look at Wagner and Africa Corp now, we are talking about mercenary, not a PMC, even if their military badge is written PMC in Russia. If we talk in Ukraine, that's a different ballgame, because these are contracted soldiers, the Russian with the one in Russian nationality. Looking at the Chinese, as mentioned before, even if you look at a lot of newspapers, there are different levels, even mercenary, private military. But up to now, we are talking about private security. Passive stance, most of the time non-armed, but the big problem is not armed of non-armed. How you define private in China, because we are not talking about a liberal market. So where is the border between the state and the private start, especially with the fact that all the CEO of this company come from the PLA, BAP, or Chinese police?
I'm not a China expert, but isn't that true of Chinese state enterprises in general? In any sector of the economy, it's very hard to know where the state and private meet. It's not just in the military sphere. So there was a question right at the back. Oh, I'll come to you next, but can I go the guy at the back in the white shirt? Yeah, you had your hand up a while ago. I'll come to you next, okay?
Hello, my question will be as Houthi started bombing shipping in the Red Sea, we saw that there was an announcement by them saying that they won't be touching to the Russian and Chinese ships. Firstly, do you believe that this actually happened, that they specifically avoided any Chinese and Russian ships? If so, how much actually it might have benefited the Chinese trade in the region? And secondly, just a short following. Do you think that such relation might mean that China has been helping the Houthis in the region, or they have been cooperating in any sense?
Okay, bids from my panel. Who'd like to take that?
Well, just one bit on
Yeah,
trade, I'll
go
leave
for
the Houthi aspect.
Yeah.
I think any scenario like that damages China's interest. This was never written in the papers. My impression, you know, we all try to read between the lines sometimes, and we have to. And that, you know, China was fairly disappointed by the invasion of Ukraine, for example, just to make sort of another example of instability. So I don't think it helps China's trade. China still doesn't, even if China is upset with the invasion or was upset with the invasion of Ukraine, that doesn't mean that it needs to take a side with the West. It's not necessarily the case. But yeah, so I don't think it helps them at all. But then I'll hand over on the Houthis.
Yeah, so when it comes to the Bab al-Mandab Strait and these attacks, the Houthis are very measured in terms of they carefully select their targets. And obviously, I think one of the greatest mistakes that we've made here in the UK is we had a very good working relationship with our partners in Oman and others to actually have a positive influence in Yemen. Understanding the complexity of it, the Americans have obviously disengaged. They've been telling the Saudis for 10 years, don't bomb them, withdraw from Yemen. They did. They engaged with the Houthis, found a peaceful solution, and then now they're bombing themselves, the Houthis, because they'd have no other choice of doing it. So the Houthis have been very, very targeted in the way that they're doing it, and I think they do single out those ships that are non-Chinese related, but it doesn't really matter because you need to understand that the shipping industry, which is very much based in London, is underwritten by Lloyd's of London and other insurance companies, and if insurance companies are unwilling to insure ships and vessels going through the strait, it doesn't really matter what flag you're flying in the end of the day. So this is a global trade crisis, and it's probably the most whatever's going to happen in Gaza and Lebanon, this is going to be likely something that's going to remain an issue for global trade for quite a long time to come, because we've poked the bear, and the Houthis are not, they have no track record of being very sensible and rational in terms of engaging them at the table. What is needed is a conference for Yemen that gives some sort of security to Ansar Allah and the Houthis as well. But this trade issue will remain. And I agree with Zeno. The Chinese have absolutely no interest. It's bad for trade. It's bad for growth. It's bad for business. So they have absolutely no interest in. They're not winning. They're losing as everyone else is losing.
Yeah, of course.
Just mention that for all along the Belt and Road, insecurity and instability is bad for business. China needs stability to thrive. So the Wagnerian model in Africa is antithetic, which China is doing. But to your question about the Houthis, that was a picture that I used in my presentation last month when I was in Shanghai, and it was an oil vessel on fire in Bab al-Mandab, and it was a Chinese vessel. It was using a flag of convenience from Panama, but it was owned and managed by Chinese. For the beginning, when the Houthis started to use a drone against the sea lane of communication, there were some Chinese private security on board using loudspeaker in Arabic, saying we are Chinese. Is one of the things that they tried. But as Andrea correctly mentioned, one, not only is bad for business, because most of these ships now are moving to the Cape of Good Hope, increasing the cost, but at the same time, they are all insured here in London by the Lloyd's. And Chinese insurance from Sinosure to the other top, they all use special insurance here in London, and they are affected, even if they are not directly targeted.
Thanks, Alex. Over to you.
How does China view Africa course?
The microphone. So I want to make sure people at the back can hear your question, because it sounds interesting.
Yeah, I was interested in knowing how does China view Africa Corps in Sahel, because it was mentioned that China was upset with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And so how can this affect China's project in Africa?
This I can give you again one image. A few months ago, Central African Republic, not far from Bangui, Chinese mine got attacked. 9 Chinese miners were shot dead. Normally, this kind of violence is quite normal all over Africa, from Tanzania to DRC and so on, but Chinese miners are kidnapped for ransom, or gold has been stolen, or even the machinery that is very expensive stolen. This time in car, they were just put online and shot in the head. And the people who left, according to the local, were Caucasian. Now Wagner control all the mines in the area, and it's still Wagner. Africa Corp is part of Wagner under the direct control of the GRU, FSB, and the Russian Ministry of Defense. And this is a huge discussion that is going on between Moscow and Beijing. Yes, we are looking at the no-limit friendship between Putin and President Xi, but at the same time, there is an old Chinese say, the emperor is far and the mountain are high, and it worked pretty much in Africa when the boots on the ground do a quite different stuff. We don't have to forget that Wagner and Africa Corp take part of their revenue directly from the mining. Gold, diamond, tungsten, timber, and so on. So there is a ongoing friction between China managing this mine and the Wagner group there.
Well, thanks so much. We've got 20 minutes approximately till we have drinks. So we've got lots of time for questions. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry. So the transition of sovereignty of the British Indian Ocean Territory seemed to highlight that one of the key concerns of Western foreign policy is the potential for China to exert more influence in the world. Of course, this isn't unfounded. They already have a base in Djibouti. But at the same time, it seems to me they don't really have an interest to exert the level of control that America has, say, in policing shipping lanes. So my question is, to what extent do you think British concerns over China's potential to exert power is unfounded or perhaps necessary?
Sorry, the question is British concerns with China's hard power.
Or yeah, potential to increase its hard power, but not just Britain, the West in general.
Yeah.
I just thought that was an example of Western.
Yeah, well, I guess suspect everyone has something to say on this here. I'll just say, well, often I say different things. One is that we can choose if we want to look at China through the lenses of the higher scholar. And so we just see China rising in the same way that, you know, the Dutch and Spanish and the Britain, the US, they've been rising and they've built different kind of empires. And I think in the West, this is the perhaps more popular approach. We can wear the glasses of the sinologist and maybe think about risk appetite and the fact that that comes from, in different ways, from Sun Tzu, Marxism, China's strategic culture. And so we can think of China rising in a different way, in a very Chinese way. Probably there's a gray area, it's not binary, as we heard before. So that's what I normally tell my students. China is building aircraft carriers. A question I have is whether that is about dominance or is more about dominating or more about signaling prestige, being seen, making diplomatic connections, defense engagement. You know, if you talk to the military, they might tell you that these aircraft carriers, which in the past were, you know, about, you know, traditional way of warfare and dominating and controlling the sea, they are increasingly vulnerable nowadays to hypersonic missiles, for example. So what is China really doing are these concerns justified? And will China build more bases? The Pentagon outsourced that report, I can't remember to which company in 2004, 2005, where they mentioned the strings of pearls strategy. But what has happened in terms of strings of pearl? Is there a string of pearl nowadays? No. And how long will it take? So I don't know. It's something that we won't know for quite a long time, in my opinion. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'm going to bring Meia in on that question of not least about the aircraft carriers. You know, are they kind of sitting duck, or how important are they in terms of power projection?
Aircraft carriers, well, they are important. You, of course, have to have bases and places to host them, to maintain them, and to provide logistics for them. But I want to argue to say that the PLA isn't building a world-class military just to be able to operate in its own neighborhood within the first island chain. There is a global ambition here to build a blue water navy. it's on its way to doing so. What I think we're missing here is an understanding of timeframes and understanding of priorities. For the People's Liberation Army, the main priority in the near term and in the medium term is going to be Taiwan and the forced reunification from Beijing's perspective of Taiwan. That is what the majority of China's military force is being built for. Once that is complete, you then have to ask yourself what the rest of the PLA is going to be doing, whatever's left over it, whatever the outcome of that conflict is going to be, if there is a conflict in a sense. If there's peaceful unification, then there's a whole untouched military for the PLA to operate globally. It already does operate globally, just not in a permanent presence like the United States. Again, we have to ask, does it want to operate in exactly the same way to the same ends as the United States? But the fact that they're going to be operating globally really isn't a question here. That will touch on UK interests at the end of the day. And I think here, to return back to maybe the Gulf and to link these two topics of conversation, the Mirage. It might be an outdated aircraft for the UAE. It might be an outdated aircraft from Western standards, but the Mirage 2000 is still being operated by the Taiwanese military. And so that you have the PLA Air Force operating alongside with the Mirage 2000 in exercise in Xinjiang, of all places, with the UAE Air Force, that is an opportunity for a narrative, for us to leverage as a narrative, to call out the hypocrisy there on China's behalf and on that of a Gulf Muslim country. And second of all, to connect the dots to show that what's happening between China and the Middle East, it does have an impact on second and third order issues like the security of Taiwan.
That sounds like a peg for comment, but I mean,
Fully agree.
fully agree. Good. Yeah, sounds like an extremely interesting point. Where are we going next for a question? Over here. Yep, got two there actually.
Hi, thanks. I was wondering what role you think China will play in the current conflict in the Middle East. And also in the last couple of weeks, we've seen in some of China's statements, them taking a little bit of a softer tone towards Israel. Is this part of their kind of mediation strategy?
Can give it a go. But the easy answer is they don't have a strategy. They're not even sitting around the table when it comes to any of the. Look, we can spend all day, and I'm the first one to call out the West for its hypocrisy on the Middle East, and particularly on Palestine and Israel. But that doesn't mean, and that's part of the problem of a lot of analysts and academics on the left who are like, oh my God, it's terrible what the West is not doing in the Middle East, is then saying, oh, look at, but, and then buying into the kind of Chinese and Russian narratives of saying, okay, they have something to offer. They have nothing to offer either. The only difference is the Chinese have never pretended that they really cared about international humanitarian law, for example, or the Russians, while we did. Now, the issue in the Middle East right now is nobody has a strategy, neither the Israelis, nor Hamas, nor Hezbollah, nor Iran, nor any of the Gulf states. Everyone is kind of waiting for someone else to take the initiative. And the ones who do take the initiative is Netanyahu and his government. And he's doing that against, some of the internal forces in the country, and to the detriment of Israeli long-term national security, I would say. The Chinese have really nothing to. The only interest they have is making sure that this gets contained as quickly as possible. They don't like the spillover. They don't want an escalation between Iran and Israel. They didn't want the escalation in Lebanon, because all of the things that we said before, right? It's very bad for business. But they're not offering any way of being able to mediate. I mean, if someone talked about Iran and Saudi, I would say that the Saudi-Iran rapprochement is very meaningful. I was very critical initially, but over the last 18 months, I think it has developed. Yesterday at dinner with a couple of people from Saudi ministries, the Saudis are looking at the Iranians in a very different light. That's not because of the Chinese. I mean, there's been a lot of legwork going into creating this rapprochement, but it has developed into something robust. Not because of the Chinese, but because of the lack of Western leadership, the lack of US leadership, the lack of trust in US leadership as well. So the relative strength of China, if you will, in this context, because they haven't received it, is actually the weakness of the West. And, when you speak to Arabs, they will, especially Gulfis, they will tell you the biggest issue with this conflict in Palestine right now is not Israel's reputation, because they always knew what Israel was all about. They're just feeling that they're being confirmed. The biggest casualty in this conflict is the West, is our Western standing, US in particular, but also UK and other European countries, our standing in the world. And that is something that might, in relative terms, favor the Chinese because they have no standing, because they don't have to put a position out there, hence you can't attack them on that position. But the simple answer is they have absolutely no strategy. They haven't made any effort to bring anyone around. Even them hosting PLO and Hamas representatives, which was a kind of a low-hanging fruit of getting them, anybody could host them today and they would come and fly in because that's what they're used to. I mean, PLO in particular, they've been a kind of backroom roundtable sort of entity that goes and meets people and has meaningless agreements. So, the Chinese haven't been able to do anything with that. It's just a way to kind of go for the low-hanging fruit. But none of the things that matter, which is a ceasefire in Gaza, ceasefire in Lebanon, which are the key diplomatic issue that some people are working on, the Chinese are not around the table. They have no role to play in that.
Thank you. You have noticed the clink of bottles at the back. So that's just an incentive to stay with us. We've got 10 more minutes to go. There's a guy in the middle who wanted a question. Sorry, no, not you're next, but the guy in the white shirt in front of you.
Yeah, my question is about how sustainable it is for countries in the Gulf, for example, to play the balancing act. And I think you said earlier that at some point the West will need to decide whether or not they can trust these states to trust them to sell weapons, advanced weapons to them because of the worry that Chinese technology is already in the system. And when that happens, which side would they turn to? I think there is a bit different in Africa. I think you were talking about earlier that China is the top country when it comes to arms sales. Am I right to think that it's because these countries are already under sanctions by the West and there's opened up a space for China to provide or to export the weapons to the region?
Thanks a lot. May, do you want to take that one?
So your question was, is there a tipping point whereby countries are going to have to make choices? Yes, but it's of course also, I think, in the West's interest to ensure that tipping point doesn't fall against our favor. The Middle East remains an important area and region and partner for Western countries as well. And so whereas we might have withdrawn forces from Afghanistan, there is still an interest to remain engaged in the region. And certainly I would argue for European countries, the Middle East remains particularly important for security terms. We have this debate outside of the Middle East, of course, as well. This is a debate and a question that is asked and raised in Southeast Asia, in other parts of the world. And here, I guess the point is, you don't make countries, you don't tell countries to choose, but you say what's on the table. And there are just certain things that cannot be on the table if certain conditions are not met. And the most sensitive, the most advanced defense technology is a card that isn't going to be traded for nothing. And that goes very much back to what Andreas was saying about the nature of some of the most advanced fifth generation and next generation defense technologies.
Very, very briefly, a point from reading about Cold War, New Cold War for one of my books. I think, and I know I've discussed this with others. So the big question is for how long any country can handle the strategic competition with multi-alignment, ambiguity. I think one important point to bear in mind is that when we say these countries, most of the countries we think of, whether it's UAE, Brazil, Indonesia, and so on, they are much more powerful. I think we can say that, much more influential than countries that were part of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. They have more resources, more military power, and so on. So yes, for how long they can be ambiguous, but on the other hand, to what extent can the US, China influence these countries? If I had time, I think I would like to, I have to focus on the US and China, but it would be fascinating to talk to diplomats from many of these, what we call middle powers, and just to get a sense of how they handle that on a daily basis. I think it would be very, very interesting.
I'm sure the Lau Institute could host something if you suggest it. We've got 5 minutes. I'm going to not bring in the rest of the panel, but go to that gentleman in the middle who had a question.
Jump in because it was part of Africa.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Okay. Jump in quick.
I would just say US is still the leading weapons seller to Africa with 40%, followed by Russia and France. What I was mentioning before, that 90% it was China in the sub-Saharan Africa. That was quite specific to that area, but it's important because there is a rise on China. And this is due to three overlapping trends. One, anti-French sentiment, less appetite buy French weapon system. Second, Russia sanction, but not only sanction. Russia need military hardware in Ukraine. And third, China offer quite a good financial opportunity in acquiring Chinese military hardware. At the same time, in the Gulf especially, Chinese weapons are used as a bargaining chip sometimes. So we don't have to forget that if US is not willing to sell, someone jump in and say, okay, I'm going to buy it from Beijing if you don't sell me. And the fact that there is a long-term relationship in missile defense system with Saudi Arabia is just because at the time of Iran and Iraq war, and there were Russian Scud missiles flying all over the country, the Saudi requested the Patriot anti-missile system to the US. It was not delivered, so they opted for the Dongfeng ballistic missile from China.
Thank you, Alex. Last question.
The question, I think sir has actually answered that.
Oh, that's answered your question? No, that's great.
Wow.
That's very, very convenient. I actually want to ask you the last question, the four of you, and see what you think. I mean, one of the things that's in my mind listening to all this is there an overall coherence to what China is doing in the world? Is there, or is there simply, are we simply looking at a series of opportunistic tactical moves which are a reflection of China's understanding that the world order is shifting, American power is declining, and they're just taking advantage? Or are we looking at something which is thought through, systematic? So quick, let's start over here.
I'll take it back to some of the readings I've done recently for the Cold War, New Cold War discussion. This is Western. Prominent historian was saying that China's primary interest is regional. And so there is not an internationalist approach to foreign policy as the Soviet Union had. So that's where the coherence is eventually, if we want to find it. Just another point, something I always tell my students. We discuss a lot about what China does for its interest, to protect its interest. But what is that does not do, and it's not just Palestine or Ukraine, it's also climate change, COVID. In any of these big crises, China wasn't there and probably has no interest to be there for the time being.
That's not the definition of hegemony, is it?
Yeah.
Meia.
I'll say what it isn't. And what I don't think it is an actor that has 100-year plan perfectly dotted out and a map with pins in it of exactly what it wants to achieve everywhere all the time with a perfect roadmap. I think that's giving the CCP far too much credit. What I do think drives Chinese behavior is a careful examination of their strengths and weaknesses, learning from others and others' mistakes in particular, and then seeking out opportunities as they come along. And sometimes that is holding kind of a place warm for itself through elite network management and relationship building, waiting for the perfect time to arise. And other times it's actively going after some strategic key areas of interest.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Andreas.
I think the Chinese have a grand strategic vision for what they want to do, and then opportunities fall within that vision from time to time, and then they kind of connect it to it. I think the difference here is influence versus power. I think they're not so much power centering. That's why people in the Gulf, at least, don't recognize and perceive the Chinese as, you know, a very overreaching sort of power. They're seeing them more benign than they're seeing the Americans. They appear to be less tit for tat or less, you know, zero sum as the Americans are. But it's because the Chinese don't work with coercion, they work with compulsion. So if you look at, you know, influence from coercion on one end and consensus on the other, Chinese are not very good at building consensus, but they're quite good to create these sort of interconnections that create compulsive behavior, whereby people just voluntarily, because there are implicit threats in this relationship, that they fall in line, and that kind of helps them to achieve what they want to achieve and help them to achieve influence. But, you know, hegemony, I think that's a concept that no longer fits any of the actors in the Middle East.
Discuss.
Yeah.
Alex.
In this respect, I believe that the problem is that we think strategy in Western-centric way, while China has a totally different approach to strategy. So I will say that at the long term, that's the goal is not going to work perfectly, but learning from own mistake and other mistake is a priority. So the big lesson learned for the PLA was Desert Storm. Don't get face to face with the United States in a direct confrontation, and it's still working very well now. What is learning on daily basis from the Ukraine conflict? It's a lot of new manual update for the doctrine. But then at the end, we are go to back of the basis. Strategy has a different meaning in Beijing than here. Meaning, don't let me be banal in this, but we play chess in a very Clausewitzian way. We go for the killing of the king. Chinese strategies play Wei Qi, play Go. That is not killing, is encircling, strangling. So when you look at the Belt and Road Plan and you get Kazakhstan, Djibouti, UAE, you start saying what these pieces are playing around, but after a while you start to see that there is a picture.
So they're collecting a lot of pawns, basically, is what you're saying. Yeah. Right, well, brilliant. It's past on the dot. Thank you very much. Can I ask you to join me in thanking our fantastic... Thank you.